Listen, all you New Yorkers. Excuse me, taxi. Okay, we're looking around. This is the 77 WABC minicast.
Welcome back to a live broadcast of the Roger Stone Show. I'm Jake Novak filling in for Roger Stone, and you are in for a major treat right now. This is a segment I've been wanting to do for a long time with James Rosen. He is the senior Washington correspondent for a major national television news channel. He was also at Fox News for many years. He and I worked together, and this is where I first met James about 30 years ago at a station here in New York called New York One, a local television station that has good political coverage, or at least extensive political coverage. James is also an author. You should read all of his books, but he has a brand new book out called Scalia, the Supreme Court Years 1986 to 2001. And James, I want to start from the beginning of the Supreme Court years because June 19th, 1986 was, as we say in this business, a big news day. I had a final exam that day. I came home early because we just had the exam, not a regular day of sessions. I turned on the TV and I see President Reagan is announcing the retirement of Warren Burger. He had been the Chief Justice of the United States. By the way, that is the title. It is not Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he was announcing that first, William Rehnquist would be President Reagan's choice to become the new Chief Justice, and that somebody named Antonin Scalia would replace Rehnquist as an Associate Justice. And a few hours later, we learned that Len Bias had died of a cocaine overdose at the University of Maryland. That was a very big day in news, James, but that's the kickoff point, at least for the years of your second book about Antonin Scalia, correct?
Well, great to be with you, Jake. You're very kind to have me on. The new book is called Scalia, Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2001. And this covers the first half of Justice Scalia's momentous tenure on the Supreme Court, nearly 30 terms. So this is the first half of it, and it ends with the national trauma of Bush v. Gore. It starts from his first day on the job. And of course, this is the second installment in a 3-volume biography of Justice Scalia. The first volume came out 3 years ago. It was called Scalia Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. And it ends with him taking his seat on the Supreme Court. These books are not just written for lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, and I wrote the thing. And they're a lot of fun because Scalia was so lively and funny. And they tell us in broadcast school, and you know this, Jake, never to correct the anchor or the host, but in the interest of historical accuracy, I feel compelled to mention that the famous announcement in the White House press briefing room, which completely took the press by surprise, of the retirement of Chief Justice Burger and the appointment of Justice Rehnquist to succeed him, and of Judge Antonin Scalia to succeed Rehnquist, by President Reagan occurred on June 17, 1986.
Okay.
I'm not sure what day Lenny Bias left us, but in any case, the first day of being on the job, the reader, you see going into the Supreme Court and looking around you, you see it through Scalia's eye sockets. What was it like to be a justice for the first day? What's the building like? What's it like to walk around there? And I had access to so many documents that have never been published before, among them Scalia's private correspondence. And he wrote to a friend shortly after his first conference. That's where the Chief Justice and the other 8 justices gathered by themselves, only the justices, 9 of them, in the conference room, this ornate room with law books and the dark paneling at the Supreme Court. And the purpose of the conference is to go over the cases where they've heard oral arguments a couple of days earlier and go down the line in order of seniority. The chief goes first, but then in order of seniority, meaning who's been there the longest. They go one at a time and they say how they're going to vote on the cases. And Justice Scalia, of course, was the junior justice. It was his first day on his first conference. And so he was last to speak, 9th. And in this private letter to a friend, he said that when it was finally his turn to open his mouth and address the other justices, he felt like a character in a Woody Allen movie, quote unquote. So again, it's not just for lawyers, and you will read not only how Antonin Scalia changed American law forever and how that affects every single one of us still today, but you'll also see the man. You'll see the devout Catholic. The first volume traced the formation of Scalia's Catholic faith as a valedictorian at Jesuit schools. This book shows you his efforts, the strenuous efforts he maintained to separate the tenets of his Catholic faith from his jurisprudence as a justice on the United States Supreme Court, because he understood that just as latter-day justices and judges today should not be grafting their own policy preferences onto existing texts like the Constitution or some law passed 10 minutes ago or 10 years ago, he didn't think it was proper either for a Catholic justice to superimpose his his faith onto the jurisprudence. The way he would put it, Jake, is he'd say, there's no such thing as a Catholic hamburger. The closest we could come would be a hamburger that is made perfectly.
It's so serendipitous that you mentioned that part of his real convictions as a justice, because we're about to be joined, on some of these stations by former Governor Andrew Cuomo. And at about the same time that Scalia was going through this, from what you could say a conservative side, Andrew Cuomo's father, Mario Cuomo, when he was governor, made a very famous speech at Notre Dame, quoting St. Thomas Aquinas correctly in Latin, I might add, talking about the same thing. How could he separate his Catholic faith from his duties as governor, et cetera, et cetera? These are the kinds of debates we were having in American society about political philosophy at that time. I don't know if the 80s were a better time or not. Obviously, I'm being a little nostalgic, but it's quite impressive in any way that you look at it. James, we're going to go to a break. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about this book, because you got to get it. It's the second in 3 books. James Rosen is doing the Robert Caro, devoting a lot of his life to one man, and we're going to get back to that when we come back with James Rosen. And I'm Jake Novak, filling in for Roger Stone. On the line with us is James Rosen, continuing our interview. And James is the author of Scalia, Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2001. That's the new book, the second of 3 that he's going to have out for us by the end of this endeavor. And James, you made the point. You are not a lawyer. This is not a law book. This is not going into the specifics of each and every case. A lot of this is the personal stuff, the emotional stuff that this entire program actually has been talking about. And I found it compelling that you have quite a bit in this book about 2 other justices in the court who, shall we say, did not treat Scalia very nicely.
So there's maybe 3 if you count them all. And this book, as you mentioned, is called Scalia, Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2001. It's the definitive biography, and this covers the first half of his momentous nearly 30 terms on the Supreme Court, and it ends with Bush v. Gore in 2000, 2001, the aftermath. And it does go into his relationships with the other justices. Scalia was basically, when he came to the court in 86, he found it to be a sort of intellectually incoherent place. And he enforced rigor on it through his philosophy of originalism. That is to say, when a judge is doing their central business, which is interpreting the law and telling us what the law means, you shouldn't adopt some living constitution model where the text expands to include new meanings. You should be bound by the original meaning as it was widely understood at the time, when the Constitution or any given law enacted since was enacted at that time, whatever meaning it had at the time. And that's the most honest kind of judge. And there were people on the court at the time, like Sandra Day O'Connor, William J. Brennan, Harry Blackmun, the author of Roe versus Wade, who didn't like that philosophy because it cuts down on the power of the judge. If the judge is bound by what the law meant at the time and isn't free to graft his or her own latter-day policy preferences onto that text, then the judge, the power of the judge is quite limited, and that's the very limited view of the power of judges in a separation of power system that Scalia held. They didn't like being taken into account. In fact, in one opinion, Scalia wrote that Sandra Day O'Connor's writings, particularly on the subject of abortion, quote, cannot be taken seriously. And that led to a long breach between them. Justice Brennan was really Scalia's idol, even though Brennan was the essence of the living constitutionalist liberal judge. But I found papers in Brennan's files at the Library of Congress that had never been published before, and conducted interviews as well that showed that Scalia's admiration for Justice Brennan was not returned. And it's doubtful that Scalia, when he went to his grave, had any idea just how dim and dour a view of Scalia Justice Brennan took. And then there's Harry Blackmun, whom we mentioned earlier, the author of Roe versus Wade. Scalia had criticized it as a professor on television in the 70s, called it the embodiment of the imperial judiciary. And Blackmun wasn't looking forward to it when Scalia joined the court. And I found evidence or my researcher, I should say, found evidence in Blackmun's papers that showed that Blackmun's clerks kept up a secret written vendetta against Scalia and his clerks, including branding them as Federalist Society members as though that were somehow a scarlet letter, in writing, and in a way that Blackmun never discouraged, but to the contrary, egged on with his own written comments that were denigrating of Scalia and his clerks, of people who are now very accomplished. Some of them, one of those targeted, for example, was Christopher Landau, who is today the Deputy U.S. Secretary of State under Marco Rubio, or John Manning, Dean of the Harvard Law School. And it was really kind of a shameful exercise by Blackmun and his clerks, and it showed that they kind of were gunning for Scalia when he got to the court. All of that is, and how he coped with all of this. Again, in memoranda and correspondence that's never been published before, where you get to hear Scalia's own voice taking these people on. It's really riveting, and as I say, it's not just for lawyers.
We're speaking with James Rosen, chief national Washington correspondent, I should say, for a large national news channel. He's also an author. He's written many books, but right now we're talking about his latest, Scalia, the Supreme Court years 1986 to 2001, available on all those platforms where you can buy books and hear them or see them on a computer. You know how that goes. James, I think it's fair to say that before Scalia came on the court, we really didn't have an icon of the judiciary for conservatives. We certainly had an icon for modern-day liberalism in Earl Warren, who was not on the court at the same time as Scalia, but he was the one who came down with the Miranda decision, a number of other decisions that are icons or major benchmarks, landmarks for liberal thought in this country. Yeah, then you had Warren Burger as the Chief Justice, who was very much a centrist. I mean, that was his real calling card. And then you had Scalia, who was never Chief Justice of the United States, but certainly became the icon of conservative. And there have been many that have followed since then. Now we have people like, we've had Clarence Thomas. We've had Justice Alito. But before any of those could come around, you had to have Scalia. Scalia was the one who created this mold. Am I right?
One notable omission in that recitation is William Rehnquist, who for 15 lonely terms from 1972 until his appointment to the Chief Justiceship in 1986 was the sole conservative on the court, and who wrote in solo dissent. That means in cases where he was dissenting 8 against 1, so many times, 54 times in those 15 terms, that his clerks actually gave him a Lone Ranger doll. But Rehnquist did not really, apart from his conservatism, he didn't really belong to originalism as a philosophy. And Scalia was the first to bring that to Supreme Court jurisprudence. But in that whole period of the 70s and 80s, as Scalia's star was rising, the dominant intellectual force in conservative legal circles off the bench off the Supreme Court was Robert Bork. And everyone thought that Bork was going to get there first to the Supreme Court before Scalia. Ultimately, the Reagan administration made a very savvy decision to pair the elevation of Justice Rehnquist, who was a controversial figure, with Scalia's nomination, because Scalia was the first Italian-American appointed to the court and had a winning personality, and it was foreseen that he would basically sail through. Bork, not so much. And of course, we saw how it went when Bork was nominated as the next judicial nomination at the Supreme Court after Scalia. And there's a chapter in that, and how the relationship between the two men of Scalia and Bork never really recovered from this sort of entwinement of their personal lives and their ambitions and the law itself.
You're listening to James Rosen, and James, this is the two things we've just talked about. We talked about many things about your book, but we've heard about the justices in the court who resented Scalia and in some cases even plotted against him. And we're talking now about Robert Bork resenting him eventually after he didn't get on the court. Boy, it's a lot of personality. Listen, you've been a DC-based journalist for a long time, more than 20 years, James. And but I do think you're still able to be out of that bubble long enough to answer honestly to this question. I mean, is there a more arrogant, thin-skinned world than the D.C. area where people think they're so very important? Now, Supreme Court justices are actually very important. But in the years that I lived in D.C., I mean, some of the lowest-level government bureaucrats and the way that they carried themselves, I could only imagine the way their superiors were. I mean, to me, as compelling as this is, and everyone should read it because it is compelling and interesting, it's also sad that these people of such high education and achievement are still so petty and arrogant. And there's the one thing an arrogant man, James, that an arrogant man hates more than anything else is another arrogant man. Honestly, that's really where it goes. And it just seems like there's a lot of that going on. This
brings to mind Wayne LaPierre's famous maxim that the only the only person who can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Yeah.
And maybe it's that way in the chambers of the Supreme Court as well. They often say publicly, we always get along, there's never any bitterness, but if you read the private correspondence and you do the interviews and you can tell the true story of what happens, yeah, there is bitterness from time to time. And sometimes that bitterness can last decades between a pair of justices, and sometimes they bury the hatchet. And that's going to be part of Volume 3 when that comes out. But these are very human figures. It also brings to mind what Henry Kissinger said about academia. He said the reason that the fights are so large is precisely because the stakes are so small. That's not true on the Supreme Court. The stakes are the lives of every single American because, again, Antonin Scalia's legacy on the Supreme Court affects every one of us today. If you do a 360 or maybe just a 180 if you're driving, you look around and everything you see and touch, Antonin Scalia played a very significant role in how we govern ourselves with respect to that activity. And if you want to understand modern America and how we got here, check out these books.
Okay. James, we have just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to get your, again, we're talking to James Rosen, author of the book. Let's again get that name out there. Scalia, the Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2001, the second of 3 volumes that James is writing about the great Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. James, just quickly, what's your, obviously the Supreme Court exists today. We have a lot of these divisions as well now. How does all of your work that you've done on Antonin Scalia, affect your way that you look at the court now and the makeup of the court now? What are some of the things that really stand out now that you know so much about what went on during his tenure?
Well, I had an opportunity to interview a number of the justices for this project over the years, most recently Justice Alito in Chambers about a year ago, and I published an op-ed in Politico magazine to promote this book on the day that it came out, February 10. And after our segment, I'll link to it on my X feed, which is at James Rosen TV. And I wanted to know from Justice Alito, who, of course, wrote the Dobbs opinion, which overturned Roe versus Wade after 50-plus years on the books. And was there a direct line, a connection between Antonin Scalia as a professor arguing against Roe versus Wade on PBS programs in the 1970s and in his concurrences and dissents in the abortion cases that came before the court in the 80s and 90s, the Webster and Casey cases? Is there a direct line from all of that to Dobbs? And Justice Alito told me absolutely there is. He said, I flatter myself to think that had Nino written Dobbs, he would have written it just as I wrote it. And he even told me that there was a model of sorts that he looked to for an originalist opinion on the subject. And that was Scalia's majority opinion in D.C. versus Heller, in which the constitutional right to own a handgun was enshrined in 2008. And he said that was the Heller opinion was kind of a model for Dobbs. So, yes, it informs our view of how the court is operating and functioning today, because the legacy of Antonin Scalia is so prominently still with it.
Yeah, it's amazing how there is that tradition, that legal tradition. It sounds very much like the rabbinic tradition in Judaism, and also in the Catholic, in the Catechism and in canon law. You can't just say, "I've got this new idea." You need to cite your sources. One of the things my father drilled into my head is if I was going to say anything about religion and make a speech or write, I had to cite sources. And that's, of course, the way things work in the law, at least when they're working correctly. This is something, by the way, James, that Ketanji Brown Jackson has been criticized for, not making these kinds of citations, kind of going off on her own logic. And you can see how she's been denigrated so much from that. But James Rosen, the name of the book is Scalia, 1986 to 2001, the Supreme Court Years. I got the order of that wrong. The Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2001. You can get it on. Tell us how people can get the book before we say goodbye.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can go to the Skyhorse or Regnery websites, anywhere fine books are sold.
Okay, fantastic. James Rosen, a fantastic journalist and fantastic author, does both of those things. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you, my friend. You too.
All right. I'm Jake Novak, filling in on the Roger Stone Show. We're going to be right back with more. It is a live radio broadcast, folks. We're not taking a rest on Sunday.